By the time Alexander's army understood what was happening, it was already too late to stop it. Men were collapsing in the line of march, not from wounds or battle, but from thirst so severe they could no longer stand. Pack animals fell where they walked and were stripped bare within minutes. Entire sections of the column moved in silence, saving breath, staring at the ground, knowing that stopping meant being left behind. This was not a defeat inflicted by an enemy, nor a retreat forced by battle. It was the result of a choice. Alexander the Great, conqueror of the Persian Empire, had deliberately led his army into the Gedrosian desert, one of the most unforgiving regions known to the ancient world. What followed would erase tens of thousands of lives and leave behind a march so catastrophic that even ancient historians struggled to explain why it had ever been attempted. In 325 BCE, Alexander stood at the height of his power. His army had marched from Macedonia across Anatolia, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Persia, breaking forces that once ruled the known world. Cities fell, kings fled, and Alexander's name alone was enough to bend entire regions to his will. But beneath the image of unstoppable conquest, the campaign was beginning to fracture. Years of continuous marching had hollowed out the army. Veterans were worn down, replacements were inexperienced, and supply lines stretched impossibly far behind them. When the army reached India and refused to march farther east, it marked a turning point. Alexander did not lose a battle, but he lost momentum, and for the first time, he was forced to turn back. The return west was meant to be controlled and deliberate. Alexander planned to stabilize the empire, secure roads, and link his land forces with a fleet commanded by his admiral Nearchus along the southern coast. Instead of retracing safer routes, Alexander chose to lead his army through Gadrosia. Even in antiquity, the region was infamous. Ancient writers described it as a land of extreme heat, scarce water, and vast distances between any settlements. It was not unmapped territory. It was territory known to kill. Why Alexander chose it remains debated. Some saw strategic necessity, others saw pride, and some believed it was punishment for an army that had refused him in India. Whatever the motive, the decision committed an already exhausted force to a route with almost no tolerance for failure. The desert itself quickly became the true enemy. An army of this size required enormous quantities of water and food just to survive, and every additional person multiplied that demand. Alongside soldiers marched servants, laborers, families, merchants, and animals, hauling supplies and plunder. Wells that might sustain a village for weeks were expected to sustain thousands. When the front of the column reached water, the rear often arrived to find it gone. Movement during the day was punished by heat, but stopping meant losing ground. The desert turned logistics into a weapon, draining strength unevenly and ensuring that the weakest and slowest were the first to fall. Timing made everything worse. Desert travel depended heavily on season and weather, and small miscalculations carried fatal consequences. Coordination with the fleet was unreliable, as the coastline was difficult to navigate, and the army frequently drifted inland, severing contact with any hope of resupply. Navigation on land depended on guides, memory, and rumor. Wells could be dry, routes could vanish beneath shifting sand, and a single wrong assumption could send thousands marching toward nothing. As days passed without relief, discipline began to erode. Thirst turned into panic, panic into desperation, and desperation into mistakes that accelerated the collapse. Eventually, the last traces of greener land disappeared behind them. Turning back meant crossing the same barren ground with fewer supplies and weaker bodies. Continuing forward meant trusting that water existed somewhere ahead. This was the moment the march stopped being a campaign and became an ordeal. Rank no longer protected anyone. Authority could not create water. Once the desert began selecting who could keep pace, the process fed on itself. Those who fell behind died. Their supplies vanished. Their absence slowed the rest. The army thinned not through battle, but through attrition measured in hours and steps. The Gedrosian desert did not destroy Alexander's army in a single dramatic blow. It dismantled it quietly, body by body, decision by decision. By the time the worst lay ahead, the structure of the army was already breaking apart. What remained was hunger, thirst, and an environment that did not recognize greatness. Alexander had chosen the road, and the road had begun to decide who would survive it. From here on, the march would only grow more brutal, and the distance between endurance and death would narrow with every step. The Gedrosian march didn't collapse in a single dramatic moment. It collapsed the way systems collapse, slowly at first, then all at once. In the early days, the column still resembled an army. Officers moving along the line, men trying to hold formation, animals carrying loads that had crossed half the world. But the desert immediately began turning structure into dead weight. Heat punished movement so severely that every step felt like a theft of strength. Water became the only subject that mattered. Men stopped talking about victories and started trading rumors. A well ahead, an oasis beyond the ridge, a river that might exist if the guides were telling the truth. And every hour that those rumors failed to become real, the same fear returned sharper than before. Thirst does more than weaken the body. It rewrites the mind. As the days stretched on, soldiers began making decisions that would have been unthinkable earlier in the campaign. When water appeared, some drank too quickly and collapsed afterward, their bodies unable to handle the shock. Others drank from pools that tasted of salt or rot, because refusing meant dying later instead of sooner. Ancient writers describe men scooping muddy liquid from depressions in the ground, not caring what else came with it. Discipline still existed in theory, but enforcement depended on men who were barely standing. Orders were given and ignored. Arguments broke out over water skins. A few mouthfuls became worth more than rank. The desert didn't need to defeat them in battle. It only needed to make survival feel immediate and personal. The terrain worsened the damage. Gadrosia was not just dunes, but a shifting mixture of sand, gravel plains, and broken ridges that punished consistency. Wind erased tracks and made the horizon unreliable. The sun bleached everything into glare, so distance became a kind of illusion. An oasis could seem close for hours. As if the land was deliberately lying, this is where the column began to fracture. The front might reach a rumored water source and find a shallow pool. By the time the rear arrived, it was mud. That created a brutal hierarchy inside the march itself. Those who could push forward drank first. Those slowed by fatigue, injury, or heavy loads arrived last and got nothing. The desert turned the army into a daily selection process, and the ones selected against simply vanished. Then the animals started dying in numbers that the march couldn't absorb. Horses collapsed, pack animals followed, and with every animal that fell, the army lost the ability to carry what kept it alive. Carts were abandoned, tents were discarded, armor and heavy equipment, once symbols of conquest, became liabilities left behind to save energy. Food was thrown away because it was too heavy to justify the water needed to move it. The column began shedding its own bones. And because the baggage train was enormous, this didn't happen neatly. It happened in bursts of desperation. Straps cut, loads dumped, men arguing over what mattered more, then stumbling onward, as if they had amputated parts of themselves just to keep walking. This is where the march becomes truly disturbing, because the cost wasn't paid evenly. Ancient armies carried more than soldiers. They carried servants, laborers, merchants, families, people who existed in the shadow of the force and suffered first when resources disappeared. When water ran low, those who couldn't keep pace were left behind. The wounded became a delay the march could not afford. People who collapsed were not executed, but the result was the same: being abandoned in a landscape that does not support life. And because this happened day after day, it normalized horror. Bodies were left unburied because stopping meant falling behind. Falling behind meant becoming one more shape on the ground that the column refused to look at for too long. Alexander remained with the army, and ancient sources emphasize it. They describe him sharing the march, refusing water offered to him so that no one could say the king drank while others suffered. Those gestures mattered emotionally, but they did not change the physics of the desert. Leadership can inspire endurance, but it cannot create wells. It cannot lower temperature. It cannot shorten distance. Alexander's presence also locked the army into a dangerous psychology. If the king keeps moving forward, turning back feels like betrayal. The march had passed the point where admitting failure was possible without cracking the myth that held everything together. So the army continued deeper, not because it believed in safety ahead, but because it couldn't bear the idea of retreating through the same emptiness with weaker bodies and fewer supplies. What makes the Gedrosian disaster more than bad luck is how clearly the failure stack forms when you name it. The route was infamous. The army was already exhausted from years of campaigning. The column was huge and slow, multiplying water needs beyond what the land could reliably provide. Navigation depended on uncertain guides and water sources that might be dry. Any coastal support was fragile, and losing contact meant the army was truly on its own. Timing mattered, and in harsh regions, timing is often the difference between suffering and extinction. None of these factors alone guarantees catastrophe, but together they create a trap. The more the march struggled, the slower it moved. The slower it moved, the more water it needed. The more desperate it became, the more mistakes it made. Deep in Gadrosia, the Macedonian army stopped resembling the force that had conquered empires. It became a thinning stream of survivors dragging itself across land that offered no forgiveness and no clean endings. Men disappeared daily, some collapsing in sight of others, some wandering off in delirium, some simply falling behind until the column moved on and the desert swallowed what remained. The march continued because there was nothing behind them except the same emptiness and the bodies already left there. Every day there were fewer voices, fewer animals, fewer supplies, and more silence. What finally emerged from Gadrosia was not an army in the way Alexander's forces had once been understood. It was a remainder. Ancient sources struggle to agree on numbers, and that uncertainty itself is telling. Some claim tens of thousands were lost. Others reduce the toll. What remains consistent is the scale of disappearance. Entire units were gone. Veterans who had marched from Macedonia simply never reappeared in the record. Animals were nearly wiped out. Equipment was shattered or abandoned. When the survivors reached safer ground, they did not arrive in triumph or formation. They arrived scattered, emaciated, and altered. This was not a return from campaign. It was an escape from something that should never have been attempted. Alexander himself survived, but the march left marks that victory could not erase. Ancient writers describe him pushing forward relentlessly, yet even they cannot fully mask the damage. Gedrosia broke the illusion that his campaigns were guided by something close to destiny. Until then, disasters could be reframed as sacrifices on the road to greatness. This was different. There was no city taken, no enemy defeated, no strategic gain that justified the cost. The desert offered no narrative reward. Alexander reached safety not as a conqueror expanding his empire, but as a commander who had gambled with his army and lost far more than he gained. The immediate aftermath forced practical adjustments. Replacements had to be found, units had to be restructured. The empire Alexander ruled was vast, but manpower was not infinite, and veterans were irreplaceable. The loss of experienced soldiers weakened future campaigns and strained garrisons across the empire. Gadrosia quietly reshaped the balance of power inside Alexander's forces, elevating some commanders while erasing others entirely. The march did not end his rule, but it changed its character. The army that followed him afterward was not the same one that had crossed Asia in the early years. It was smaller, harder, and more fragile. Ancient historians wrestled with how to explain what had happened. Some softened the disaster by emphasizing Alexander's endurance and personal suffering, turning the march into a test of leadership rather than a failure of judgment. Others hinted at punishment, hubris, or divine warning. A few treated Gedrosia as an unavoidable trial, the price of ruling the edges of the world. What they rarely did was confront the simplest explanation. The march failed because it was a bad decision layered on top of exhaustion, scale, and environment. The sources bend because admitting that truth weakens the myth they were trying to preserve. This is why Gadrosia occupies such an uncomfortable place in Alexander's legacy. It does not fit cleanly into the story of conquest. It cannot be framed as necessary. It cannot be redeemed by success. Instead, it exposes the limits of leadership when ambition outpaces reality. Even the greatest commander of the ancient world could not negotiate with thirst, distance, and heat. Gadrosia reminds us that power doesn't cancel logistics, and reputation doesn't refill wells. When those fundamentals are ignored, even brilliance becomes irrelevant. In the centuries that followed, the march through Gadrosia became a warning disguised as a footnote. Later rulers admired Alexander's victories, but few attempted to imitate this part of his journey. The desert had made its point. Armies could be defeated without being fought. Empires could bleed without being attacked. And disasters did not need enemies. Only confidence, momentum, and a refusal to turn back. Gedrosia survived Alexander, not because it resisted him, but because it did nothing at all. In the end, the most disturbing part of the Gedrosian march is not the suffering itself, but how quietly it unfolded. There was no single moment where everything collapsed, no final stand, no decisive mistake that could be isolated and corrected. There was only a slow tightening of conditions until survival became arithmetic and compassion became a liability. Alexander crossed the desert and lived. His empire endured for a time, but the march left behind a truth that even legend could not fully bury. Greatness does not protect you from the environment, and once an expedition crosses the line between ambition and endurance, history records only who vanished and who was left to tell the story.